The biting wind swept across the platform of Tonopah Junction, Nevada, carrying dust and broken promises as Rebecca Valmont clutched the tatters of her once fine dress, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The year was 1882, and the transcontinental railroad that had promised prosperity to this desert outpost had brought Rebecca nothing but heartache and desolation. Her journey west meant to secure a teaching position, and a fresh start after her father's death had left her penniless in Boston, had turned into a nightmare when bandits attacked the stagecoach connecting her to the railroad, stealing her belongings and leaving her dress torn and soiled. Now, as the late October sun disappeared behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, Rebecca stood alone on the wooden platform of the station, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Her reticule containing only a few worthless coins, and her future as barren as the Nevada desert stretching before her. The station agent had already locked the door of the small office, giving her nothing but a pitying glance and a gruff suggestion to try the saloon down the dusty street for shelter, a suggestion that made her blood run cold. A respectable woman like her would rather freeze than seek aid in such an establishment. The wind picked up, slashing through the torn fabric of her dress. Rebecca pressed herself against the station wall, seeking some shelter from the elements, when the sound of spurs jingling against wooden planks made her look up. A tall man approached, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his shoulders broad under a worn leather duster. The last light of day caught on his badge a silver star that identified him as the local lawman. Even in her distress, Rebecca noticed his measured gait, the confident set of his shoulders, and the watchful alertness in his stance that marked a man accustomed to danger. "Madam." His voice was deep, touched with the drawl of the frontier. "Station's closed for the night. You waiting for someone?" Rebecca straightened, dignity overcoming her trembling. "No, sir, her voice broke and she swallowed hard. "I've nowhere to go." The man stepped closer, and in the fading light, Rebecca could see his face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of a summer storm. They widened slightly as he took in her torn dress, the bruise forming on her cheekbone, and the proud tilt of her chin despite it all. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of the wool, still carrying his body heat and the scent of tobacco and leather, enveloped her like a sanctuary. "Name's Sheriff Jackson Steele," he said, his voice gentler than before. "And it looks like you've had more than your fair share of trouble today." "Rebecca Valmont," she replied, clutching the edges of his coat. "I was meant to teach at the school in Silver Springs, but bandits," she broke off, unwilling to revisit the terror of those moments. Sheriff Steele's jaw tightened. "Caldwell's gang. Been hitting the stage routes for months now." He glanced down the empty street. "Miss Valmont, there's a decent boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. She'll give you a clean room and ask no questions. Tomorrow we can sort out what's next for you." Rebecca hesitated. Sheriff Steele represented safety in this wild place, but she had learned hard lessons about trusting too quickly. "I have very little money, Sheriff. Mrs. Fletcher owes me a favor," he said simply. "And I reckon Silver Springs can wait a day or two for their teacher while you recover." As they walked down the dusty main street of Tonopah Junction, Rebecca felt the stares of the townsfolk curious, assessing, some openly hostile. She clutched the sheriff's coat tighter around her shoulders, grateful for its protection against more than just the cold. "Don't mind them," Steele said quietly. "Most folks here are decent enough once you know them. It's just that strangers can mean trouble in places like this." "And a woman alone even more so?" Rebecca asked, a hint of bitterness in her voice. The corner of his mouth twitched. "That too. But a woman under my protection will be treated with respect or they'll answer to me." The boarding house was a two-story wooden structure, painted a faded white with blue shutters, a touch of domesticity in the rough frontier town. Mrs. Fletcher, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, took one look at Rebecca and bustled her inside without question. "You can settle up when you're back on your feet, dearie," she said, waving away Rebecca's attempts to explain. "Any friend of Jackson Steele is welcome here." As Rebecca turned to return his coat, the sheriff shook his head. "Keep it for now, Miss Valmont. Night's going to get colder yet." "I don't know how to thank you, Sheriff. No need." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow to see how you're faring. Perhaps we can telegraph Silver Springs about your delay." After he left, Mrs. Fletcher showed Rebecca to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window overlooking the main street. The older woman brought up hot water, soap, and a simple nightgown. "Been keeping this for my niece, but she's not due to visit until spring," Mrs. Fletcher explained. "You look to be about her size. There's a dress in the wardrobe that might do for tomorrow as well." Left alone, Rebecca stripped off her ruined dress, wincing at the bruises forming on her arms and ribs. The bandits hadn't harmed her beyond rough handling, but the memory of their leering faces and cruel laughter still made her shudder. She washed away the dust and fear as best she could, then slipped into the borrowed nightgown. Sheriff Steele's coat lay across the chair. Rebecca ran her fingers over the worn leather, wondering about the man who had extended such kindness to a stranger. Boston seemed a lifetime away now, with its rigid social structures and suffocating expectations. Her father had left debts that had consumed their modest estate, and Rebecca had been forced to accept the teaching position in the Nevada Territory out of desperation rather than choice. Now, even that tenuous security was in jeopardy. Without her credentials and letters of introduction, stolen along with her trunk, would the school board in Silver Springs still honor their agreement? And if not, what would become of her in this harsh, unforgiving land? Rebecca lay down on the bed, pulling Sheriff Steele's coat over her like a blanket, finding strange comfort in its weight and smell. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, at least, she was safe. Morning brought clarity and a renewed sense of purpose. Rebecca dressed in the simple calico dress Mrs. Fletcher had provided, noting that while plain, it was clean and sturdy, far more practical for frontier life than the ruined garment she had arrived in. She plaited her chestnut hair into a simple braid and descended to the dining room where several boarders were already eating breakfast. Conversation stopped as she entered, and Rebecca felt the weight of curious stares. She held her head high, meeting their gazes with a composure she had cultivated during years of teaching the children of Boston's elite. Mrs. Fletcher appeared with a plate of eggs and bacon. "Eat up, dearie. Sheriff Steele said he'd be by after his morning rounds." True to his word, Jackson Steele arrived as Rebecca was finishing her coffee. In daylight, she could better appreciate his features, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor indicated. His brown hair was neatly trimmed, and without his coat, she could see the lean strength of his frame. "Miss Valmont," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You're looking better this morning." "Thanks to your kindness, Sheriff," she replied, rising to her feet. "I've imposed on your generosity enough. I should make arrangements to continue to Silver Springs as soon as possible." Steele's expression grew serious. "About that, I telegraphed Silver Springs this morning. The school board is concerned about your delay." Rebecca's heart sank. "They won't hold the position. They said they need assurance of your qualifications without your letters of recommendation." "I understand," Rebecca said quietly. Her future, precarious as it had been, was crumbling before her eyes. However, Steele continued, Tonopah Junction has been looking for a teacher ourselves. Our last one left rather abruptly after a dispute with the town council over, moral standards. Caught her with the blacksmith's apprentice, Mrs. Fletcher supplied helpfully from behind the counter. Scandalous business. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks. I assure you, my moral standards are beyond reproach. Sheriff Steele's mouth twitched with suppressed amusement. I don't doubt it, Miss Valmont. The point is, we have a schoolhouse standing empty and about 20 children in need of education. It wouldn't be as grand as Silver Springs, but it would be a position. Hope flickered to life in Rebecca's chest. But without my credentials, I vouched for you, Steele said simply. The town council is willing to offer you a trial period of 1 month. If the children are learning and the parents are satisfied, the position becomes permanent. Rebecca stared at him, stunned by this unexpected turn of events. You vouched for me. You know nothing about me. I know enough, he replied, his gray eyes steady on hers. I've met my share of dishonest folk in this job, Miss Valmont. You're not one of them. The schoolhouse has living quarters attached, Mrs. Fletcher added. Nothing fancy, mind you, but private, and the town provides basic furnishings. Rebecca's mind raced with possibilities. Tonopah Junction was smaller and rougher than Silver Springs, but it offered immediate security. And if she were honest with herself, the thought of leaving when she had just found safety was more daunting than she cared to admit. When would I start? She asked. Monday, Steele replied. Gives you the weekend to settle in and prepare. I can show you the schoolhouse today if you'd like. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a small bell tower. Inside, rows of crude benches faced a teacher's desk on a raised platform. A blackboard hung on the wall behind it. The attached living quarters consisted of 2 rooms, a small parlor with a cast-iron stove, and a bedroom just large enough for a bed, a wardrobe, and a washstand. It's not much, Steele said, watching Rebecca's face as she took it all in. It's perfect, she replied softly, running her fingers along the scarred surface of the teacher's desk. After the uncertainty of the past 24 hours, the humble schoolhouse represented stability and purpose. I can't thank you enough, Sheriff Jackson, he corrected her. If you're staying in town, you might as well use my given name. Jackson, Rebecca repeated, liking the solid feel of it on her tongue. And I'm Rebecca. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face and made Rebecca's heart skip a beat. Welcome to Tonopah Junction, Rebecca. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Rebecca prepared for her new role. Mrs. Fletcher helped her acquire basic necessities, a few simple dresses, undergarments, personal items, all put on credit against her future teacher's salary. Jackson introduced her to key townspeople. Mayor Thompson, a former prospector who had struck it moderately rich and now owned the mercantile. Dr. Wilson, whose medical practice served 3 counties, and Mrs. Abernathy, the minister's wife who ran the Ladies' Aid Society with military precision. Rebecca's presence caused quite a stir in the small community. Young, unmarried women were rare in the frontier territories, and educated ones even rarer. She received several dinner invitations from families with eligible sons, which she politely declined, citing her need to prepare for school. You've become quite the talk of the town, Jackson commented as he walked her back to the boarding house after showing her the town library, a single bookshelf in the back of the church. I've had 3 men ask me if you're spoken for. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. And what did you tell them? That they should direct their questions to you, he replied, his expression unreadable. Though I may have mentioned that as sheriff, I take a personal interest in the welfare of all town residents, especially those wearing your coat." Rebecca teased, gesturing to the leather duster she still hadn't returned. Jackson chuckled. "It looks better on you anyway." On Sunday evening, Rebecca moved into the schoolhouse quarters. Jackson helped carry her few possessions and stayed to make sure the stove was working properly for the cool night ahead. "The children will be curious about you," he warned as he prepared to leave. "Some of them have never had formal schooling before." "I taught children from 5 Points in Boston," Rebecca assured him. "I'm no stranger to challenging students." Jackson paused at the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading light. "You're a remarkable woman, Rebecca Valmont." Before she could respond, he was gone, the sound of his spurs fading into the gathering dusk. Monday morning arrived with a clear sky and Rebecca's stomach in knots. She dressed carefully in her newest calico dress, pinned her hair in a neat bun, and rang the school bell at precisely 8 o'clock. One by one, or in small groups, the children arrived, some scrubbed clean and wearing their best clothes, others in patched overalls or faded dresses, all regarding her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. By noon, Rebecca had assessed her students' widely varying levels of education. Some could barely recite the alphabet, while others read haltingly from dog-eared primers. A few of the older boys tested her authority with whispered comments and shuffling feet, but Rebecca had faced worse in Boston's charity schools. "My name is Miss Valmont," she had announced at the start of the day. "I expect your best effort and your respect. In return, you have my promise to teach you everything I can to help you build successful lives." She had their attention, if not yet their trust. It was a beginning. As the children filed out at day's end, Rebecca noticed Jackson leaning against the hitching post across the street, watching. She waved and he tipped his hat before crossing to meet her. "How was your first day?" he asked. "Challenging," Rebecca admitted, "but promising. There are some bright minds here starved for knowledge. Like young Tommy Jenkins, I noticed him hanging on your every word." Rebecca smiled. "He has a gift for numbers, and Mary Sullivan has read every book she could get her hands on. With proper guidance, she could go to college someday." "You see potential where others might not look," Jackson observed. "Everyone has potential," Rebecca replied. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them first." Jackson's gray eyes studied her face. "Like someone believed in you today." Rebecca thought of his coat, still hanging in her wardrobe, and the position he had secured for her on nothing more than his instinct about her character. "Yes," she said softly. "Like that." Days stretched into weeks as Rebecca settled into life in Tonopah Junction. The children responded to her teaching with growing enthusiasm, and parents reported with amazement that their offspring were discussing geography at the dinner table or practicing their sums while doing chores. Mayor Thompson officially offered her the permanent position after only 3 weeks, with a small raise to acknowledge her success. Rebecca established routine school during the day, grading papers in the evening, church on Sundays, and occasional social gatherings where she was invariably seated next to an eligible bachelor. Yet it was her encounters with Jackson Steele that she found herself anticipating most. He made a point of stopping by the schoolhouse every few days, sometimes bringing a new book for her small classroom library or interesting specimens for the children's science lessons, a petrified piece of wood, an unusual rock formation, or once, a carefully preserved butterfly. "Where do you find these things?" Rebecca asked as they walked along the town's single street one evening, the setting sun painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "I cover a lot of ground as sheriff," he explained. "I've always had an eye for the unusual." His glance at her suggested He considered her among the unusual treasures he'd discovered. "Have you always been sheriff here?" she asked, curious about the man who had so fundamentally changed the course of her life. Jackson was quiet for a moment. "No. I rode with the Union Army during the war, joined up when I was barely 18. Afterward, I drifted west, tried my hand at ranching, prospecting. Nothing stuck until I pinned on this badge 6 years ago." "It suits you," Rebecca observed. "The townsfolk respect you." "They know I'll deal fairly with them," he said simply. "Out here, that's what matters most." As November turned to December, Rebecca faced her first frontier Christmas. The schoolchildren were practicing carols for the town's celebration, and the Ladies' Aid Society enlisted her help in decorating the church. "You've brought new life to this town," Mrs. Abernathy told her as they hung evergreen boughs. "Especially to a certain sheriff who used to spend Christmas Day alone with a bottle of whiskey." Rebecca busied herself with a stubborn ribbon to hide her blush. "Jackson Sheriff Steele has been kind to everyone." "Hum," Mrs. Abernathy hummed knowingly. "And he walks you home from every town social, stands at the back of your classroom at least twice a week, and ordered a special book all the way from San Francisco that he's hiding at the Mercantile for your Christmas gift." Rebecca's hands stilled. "He did." "Don't tell him I told you," the minister's wife cautioned with a wink. "Men like to think they're mysterious." The town Christmas celebration was held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate nearly everyone in Tonopah Junction. Rebecca's students sang their carols, the Ladies' Aid Society provided cakes and punch, and Mayor Thompson read the Christmas story from the Bible. Afterward, small gifts were exchanged, mostly practical items: knitted scarves, jars of preserves, hand-carved toys for the children. Jackson found Rebecca as the celebration was winding down. "I have something for you," he said, sounding uncharacteristically nervous. "Not to be opened until Christmas morning." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. By its shape and weight, Rebecca knew it was the book Mrs. Abernathy had mentioned. "Thank you," she said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I have something for you as well." She had agonized over what to give him, finally deciding to embroider handkerchiefs with his initials, a personal gift, but not presumptuous. She handed him the small package, wrapped in a scrap of pretty paper she had saved from her Boston days. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, and Rebecca felt the now familiar flutter in her chest that his presence always evoked. "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Jackson." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Mayor Thompson called for Jackson's help with a dispute between two miners who had imbibed too much Christmas cheer. And the moment passed. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Rebecca woke early, still accustomed to the routine of school days despite the holiday. She built up the fire in her small stove and made coffee, then settled in her single armchair with Jackson's gift. Carefully untying the string and unwrapping the paper, she found a beautiful leather-bound volume of poetry by Emily Dickinson, published just last year. Inside the cover, Jackson had written in a surprisingly elegant hand, "To Rebecca who brings beauty to the wilderness. J.S." Rebecca traced the inscription with her finger, her heart full. She had mentioned her love of poetry only once, during a conversation weeks ago. That he had remembered and gone to such trouble to find this particular book spoke volumes about his feelings. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, Rebecca opened it to find Jackson standing there, a dusting of snow on his hat and shoulders. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early," he said. "I was making my rounds and saw your light." "Not at all," Rebecca replied, suddenly conscious of her disheveled hair and morning wrapper. "Please come in. I've just made coffee." Jackson stomped the snow from his boots and entered, removing his hat. His eyes fell on the open book in her chair, and a smile spread across his face. "You opened it?" "Yes," Rebecca admitted. "I couldn't wait. It's beautiful, Jackson, thank you. I'm glad you like it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the handkerchiefs she had given him, now neatly pressed. "This is fine work. No one's made anything like this for me since my mother passed." Rebecca poured coffee for both of them, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall outside her window, a rare sight in the desert. "I have something else for you," Jackson said finally. "Not exactly a Christmas gift, more of a question, really." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Yes, the stagecoach bringing the circuit judge comes through next week," he said, his gray eyes intent on her face. "He stays for 3 days to handle legal matters." "Yes, I know. School is dismissed on those days." Jackson set down his coffee cup. "Rebecca, in the months you've been here, you've become important to me, more important than I expected, than I thought possible." Rebecca held her breath, afraid to hope. "I'm not a man of many words," he continued, "but I know my own mind. And my heart tells me that I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." He reached across and took her hand. "Rebecca Valmont, will you marry me? While the judge is here." Joy bubbled up inside her, bright and overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jackson. I will marry you." His face transformed with a smile of such genuine happiness that Rebecca's heart ached with the beauty of it. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. "I've wanted to do this since the first day," he murmured, and lowered his mouth to hers. His kiss was tender yet passionate, conveying all the feelings he struggled to put into words. Rebecca responded with equal fervor, her arms sliding around his neck, her body fitting perfectly against his solid frame. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that weeks ago." Rebecca laughed softly. "Mrs. Abernathy would have had a conniption. She's been matchmaking since I arrived." "The whole town has been waiting for this," Jackson admitted. "Mayor Thompson offered me his cabin at the lake for our honeymoon." "Did he now?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "How presumptuous." "I told him I'd let him know," Jackson said, his eyes twinkling. "After I gathered the courage to ask you." The fearless Sheriff Steele nervous about a proposal. She teased. "Facing down outlaws is nothing compared to the possibility of your rejection," he said, suddenly serious. "You're an educated woman, Rebecca. You could have a very different life back east." Rebecca placed her hand against his cheek. "The life I want is here, with you." News of their engagement spread through Tonopah Junction like wildfire. By noon, Rebecca had received 17 visitors bearing congratulations and offers of help with wedding preparations. The Ladies' Aid Society immediately took charge, declaring that the town's new teacher would have a proper wedding despite the short notice. "You'll need a dress," Mrs. Abernathy declared. "My daughter left her wedding gown when she moved to Sacramento, with a few alterations." "And we'll decorate the church," Mrs. Fletcher added. "I've been saving silk flowers for just such an occasion." Mayor Thompson offered the hotel dining room for a reception. Dr. Wilson's wife promised a wedding cake, and the owner of the Silver Spur Saloon, much to Mrs. Abernathy's dismay, donated 10 bottles of his finest champagne. Through it all, Jackson watched with amused tolerance as his orderly life was swept up in wedding plans. "Just tell me when to show up and what to wear," he told Rebecca as they stole a quiet moment together the evening after their engagement. "You don't mind all the fuss?" she asked, concerned by the gleeful way the town had commandeered their simple wedding plans. Jackson shook his head. "These people are the closest thing to family either of us has out here. Let them celebrate with us." His expression softened. "Besides, I'd marry you in a burlap sack in the middle of a dust storm if that's what it took to make you my wife." The circuit judge, a portly man named Judge Harrington with a fondness for good cigars and long-winded legal opinions, arrived on schedule. He was delighted to officiate at the wedding, especially when he learned that refreshments would follow the ceremony. "Not often I get to do something as pleasant as joining two people in matrimony," he told them during the brief meeting required before the ceremony. "Usually I'm sentencing some poor fool to jail or sorting out property disputes." The wedding was set for Saturday afternoon, giving the judge time to handle the more pressing legal matters of the territory and the town time to perfect their preparations. Rebecca stayed at the boarding house the night before, as Mrs. Fletcher insisted it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the wedding. "Superstitious nonsense," Jackson grumbled when he walked Rebecca to the boarding house on Friday evening. "Humor them," Rebecca advised, squeezing his hand. "Tomorrow I'll be your wife, and we can begin making our own traditions." The expression in his eyes made her blush. "I'll hold you to that, Miss Valmont, for the last time." Saturday dawned bright and clear, as if even the weather approved of their union. Rebecca was awake with the sun, too excited to sleep. Mrs. Fletcher brought her breakfast on a tray, then shooed away her offer to help with the dishes. "Brides don't wash dishes on their wedding day," the older woman declared. "Now, Mrs. Abernathy will be here at 10 with the dress, and the Sullivan girls are coming to help with your hair. You just relax until then." Relaxing proved impossible. Rebecca paced her small room, imagining the life ahead of her. Jackson had suggested she continue teaching until children of their own required her attention. His house, soon to be their home, stood on a quiet side street, a sturdy two-story structure he had built himself with an eye toward a family someday. "I always hoped," he had confessed one evening, "but never really expected to find someone willing to share a lawman's life. It can be dangerous, Rebecca." "Life is dangerous," she had replied. "My parents played it safe all their lives, and still, my father died of influenza and left my mother to struggle alone until her heart gave out. I'd rather have joy with risk than safety without love." Mrs. Abernathy arrived precisely at 10, bearing a gown of ivory silk. "My Sarah was about your size," she said, helping Rebecca try it on. "Just needs to be taken in a bit at the waist. You're slimmer than she was." The dress was simple but elegant, with a high neck and long sleeves ending in delicate lace cuffs. The skirt fell in graceful folds to the floor, and the bodice was adorned with tiny pearl buttons. It was far finer than anything Rebecca could have afforded, and she blinked back tears as Mrs. Abernathy fussed with the fit. "It's perfect," Rebecca whispered. "I can't thank you enough." "Seeing the way that man looks at you is thanks enough," Mrs. Abernathy replied, her usual briskness softening. "Jackson Steele has been a good sheriff but a lonely man. You've changed that." By 2 o'clock, Rebecca was dressed and ready. Mary Sullivan, her brightest student, had carefully arranged her hair in an elegant chignon adorned with tiny white flowers from Mrs. Wilson's hothouse. Another student, Emma Jenkins, presented her with a bouquet of desert wildflowers mixed with evergreen sprigs and tied with white ribbon. "The whole school helped gather them," Emma explained proudly. "Teachers should have the prettiest flowers." Mrs. Fletcher dabbed at her eyes. "If only your parents could see you now." "I think they can," Rebecca said softly, touching the small cameo at her throat, the one possession of her mother's she had kept with her rather than packing in her trunk. "And I think they would approve." At precisely 3 o'clock, Mayor Thompson knocked on the door. "Ready, Miss Valmont." "I'm honored to give you away." The church was filled to capacity. Every resident of Tonopah Junction who could walk, ride, or be carried had turned out for the wedding. Even the miners from the outlying camps had come to town, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. Rebecca paused at the entrance, her hand trembling on Mayor Thompson's arm. Then she saw Jackson standing at the altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his eyes fixed on her with such love and wonder that her nervousness melted away. The simple ceremony passed in a blur. Rebecca would later remember fragments: the warmth of Jackson's hand as he took hers, the slight tremor in his voice as he repeated his vows, the weight of the gold band as he slipped it onto her finger. She had purchased a matching ring for him from the mercantile, and when she placed it on his finger, a collective sigh rippled through the congregation. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Nevada," Judge Harrington intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He beamed at Jackson. "You may kiss your bride, Sheriff." Jackson's kiss was restrained but heartfelt, mindful of their audience yet still conveying his deep emotion. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Jackson Steele, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The reception at the hotel was a joyous affair. The entire town celebrated with them, eating Mrs. Wilson's magnificent cake, drinking the saloon owner's champagne, and dancing to music provided by a trio of miners who played fiddle, harmonica, and banjo with surprising skill. "Did you ever imagine your life would lead here?" Jackson asked as they swayed together during a slow melody, his arm secure around her waist. Rebecca looked up at her husband, the words still new and wondrous in her mind. "Not in my wildest dreams, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." As the evening wore on, the children grew tired. The miners playing became more enthusiastic than skilled, and the older townspeople began to drift home. Finally, it was time for the newlyweds to depart for Mayor Thompson's cabin by the lake, where they would spend 3 days before Jackson had to return to his duties. They left amid a shower of rice and good wishes, climbing into Jackson's wagon, which had been decorated with ribbons and a slightly crooked sign proclaiming "just married." As they drove out of town, Rebecca leaned against her husband's shoulder, content beyond words. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, situated on the shore of a small lake that reflected the stars like a mirror. Jackson had arranged for supplies to be delivered earlier in the day, and a fire was already laid in the hearth, waiting only for his match to spring to life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Steele," he said, lifting Rebecca from the wagon and carrying her across the threshold. In the warm glow of the firelight, they discovered each other fully for the first time. Jackson's hands, always so steady with his guns, trembled slightly as he unfastened the pearl buttons of Rebecca's bodice. She, in turn, helped him remove his formal suit, marveling at the strength and scars revealed as each layer came away. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion and desire. "As are you," she replied, tracing a long scar that ran across his ribs. "Will you tell me about these someday?" "Someday," he promised, lowering his mouth to hers. "But not tonight." Their lovemaking was tender and passionate, a perfect expression of the feelings that had grown between them since that first night on the station platform. Afterward, lying in his arms beneath warm blankets, Rebecca felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. "I love you, Jackson Steele," she murmured against his chest. His arms tightened around her. "And I love you, Rebecca Steele, more than I have words to say." They returned to town 3 days later to begin their life together in earnest. Rebecca continued teaching, now walking to and from the schoolhouse with a gold ring on her finger and a new confidence in her step. Jackson's duties as sheriff kept him busy, but he always made time to share meals with his wife and often accompanied her on evening walks around the town. Their house quickly became a home under Rebecca's touch. She arranged her few books alongside Jackson's on the shelves he built for her, hung curtains at the windows, and planted flowers that struggled but survived in the harsh desert climate. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in spectacular colors. "I used to hate the quiet out here," Jackson admitted one such evening, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Now it seems like a blessing." Winter turned to spring, and with the changing season came news that thrilled the entire town. Rebecca was expecting their first child, due in late autumn. Jackson received the news with a mixture of joy and terror that Rebecca found endearing. "I know nothing about babies," he confessed as they lay in bed one night, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Neither do I," Rebecca assured him, "but we'll learn together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Rebecca continued teaching until the school term ended, then reluctantly agreed to take the fall term off to prepare for the baby's arrival. The ladies of the town showered her with advice and hand-sewn baby clothes, while Jackson expanded their home, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. "Boy or girl, this child will be educated," he declared as he installed bookshelves in the nursery, "and loved beyond measure." In early October, just as the desert heat was finally breaking, Rebecca went into labor. Dr. Wilson was summoned, along with Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Abernathy, who had assisted at countless births before. Jackson paced outside the bedroom door, flinching at every cry from his wife, until Mrs. Fletcher took pity on him. "She's asking for you," the older woman said. "Some husbands stay with their wives now. It's becoming more common." Jackson didn't hesitate. He entered the bedroom to find Rebecca pale and sweating, her hair damp against her forehead. She reached for his hand. "Stay with me," she whispered. He did not leave her side again, supporting her through hours of labor, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, and never once showing the fear that churned in his gut at seeing her in such pain. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to Jackson's eyes. "A fine boy," Dr. Wilson announced, placing the swaddled infant in Rebecca's arms after the women had cleaned and examined him. "Strong lungs and all his fingers and toes." Rebecca looked down at their child, red-faced and squalling, with a tuft of dark hair like his father's, and felt her heart expand with a love so powerful it took her breath away. "He's perfect," she whispered. Jackson sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Rebecca, the other hand gently touching his son's cheek. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at the tiny face that somehow combined features of them both, Rebecca knew. "William," she said. "After my father." "William Jackson Steele." Jackson nodded, his throat too tight for words. In that moment, exhausted and disheveled as she was, Rebecca had never looked more beautiful to him. She had given him not just her love, but a family, something he had secretly longed for since his own family had been shattered by war and disease when he was barely a man. "I'll keep you both safe," he vowed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always." William, quickly nicknamed Will by his father, thrived under his parents' devoted care. Rebecca recovered her strength and returned to teaching the following spring, bringing her son with her. The schoolchildren were enchanted by the baby, and Rebecca often conducted lessons with Will sleeping in a cradle beside her desk, or, as he grew older, playing on a quilt on the floor. "You're raising the most educated child in Nevada territory," Jackson teased as he watched 3-year-old Will carefully printing his alphabet under his mother's guidance. "He has your quick mind," Rebecca replied proudly, "and your stubbornness. Life in Tonopah Junction wasn't always easy." There were harsh winters when snow isolated the town for weeks, dry summers when water became precious, and occasional threats from outlaws or troublemakers passing through. Through it all, Jackson remained vigilant in his duties as sheriff, and the bond between him and Rebecca grew stronger with each challenge they faced together. When Will was 4, Rebecca gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth Rose, named for both their mothers. Where Will was serious and thoughtful like his father, Eliza was spirited and adventurous, with her mother's chestnut hair and love of books. "She'll be riding before she walks," Jackson predicted as he watched his daughter crawl determinedly toward the door, intent on escape and exploration. By the time Will was 10 and Eliza 6, Tonopah Junction had grown into a proper town. The railroad had expanded its service, bringing more settlers and businesses. The one-room schoolhouse was replaced by a larger building with 2 classrooms, and Rebecca was appointed head teacher with an assistant to help with the younger children. Jackson's jurisdiction expanded as well, requiring him to travel more frequently to outlying settlements. He always returned to his family with stories of his journeys and small treasures for the children, interesting rocks for Will's growing collection, wildflower seeds for Eliza's garden. For their 10th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised Rebecca with a trip to San Francisco, a journey made possible by the railroad, and 2 weeks leave granted by the town council in recognition of his service. "You've never seen the ocean," he explained as he presented her with tickets. "And there are bookshops and museums and theaters I want to show you." The children stayed with Mrs. Fletcher, now gray-haired but still spry, while Jackson and Rebecca embarked on their adventure. San Francisco dazzled Rebecca with its sophistication and energy after the quiet routine of Tonopah Junction. "You ever miss this?" Jackson asked as they strolled arm in arm along the bustling waterfront. "The excitement of city life?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, but not enough to trade what we have." She squeezed his arm. "Our home, our children, our life together, that's worth more than all the city conveniences." Their final night in San Francisco, they attended the opera. Rebecca, in a new blue silk dress purchased for the occasion, Jackson handsome but slightly uncomfortable in formal attire. Afterward, they walked back to their hotel under stars partially obscured by city lights. "Thank you for this," Rebecca said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It's been wonderful." "You deserve beautiful things," Jackson replied. "Sometimes I worry that I've kept you from a grander life." Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him. At 42, Jackson was still handsome, his brown hair now threaded with silver, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of squinting into the desert sun. To Rebecca, he was more attractive than ever, a man who had proven his character and love 1,000 times over. "Jackson Steele," she said firmly, "the life we've built together is more beautiful than anything I could have imagined that night you found me shivering at the station." She reached up to touch his cheek. "You wrapped me in your coat, but you've given me so much more: your heart, your name, our children, a home filled with love. That's the grandest life I could ever want." He kissed her then, there on the sidewalk of San Francisco, with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding day, yet deepened by a decade of shared joys and sorrows. "I love you, Rebecca Steele," he whispered against her lips, "and I thank God every day that you were waiting at that station." The years continued to pass, marking their lives with milestones both large and small. Will grew into a serious young man with his father's sense of justice and his mother's love of learning. At 18, he left for college in California, the first from Tonopah Junction, to pursue higher education, supported by savings his parents had carefully accumulated over the years. "I want to study law," he told them before departing. "Like Judge Harrington, but with less cigar smoke." Eliza blossomed into a beautiful young woman who combined her mother's intelligence with her father's practicality. She became Rebecca's teaching assistant at 16 and showed such aptitude that the school board created a permanent position for her. Jackson, now in his 50s, began to feel the weight of his years and the toll taken by decades of hard riding and occasional violent encounters. When Mayor Thompson's son, newly elected to the territorial legislature, proposed creating a proper sheriff's department with deputies to cover the expanded jurisdiction, Jackson readily agreed. "It's time to train the next generation," he told Rebecca as they discussed the changes. "I've been shot twice, broken more bones than I care to count, and spent too many nights away from you. I'm ready for something quieter." Rebecca, whose own hair now showed strands of silver and whose hands bore the marks of years of teaching, nodded in understanding. "You've served this community faithfully for a very long time." They had been married for 20 years when Jackson officially retired as sheriff, handing his badge to his most trusted deputy while the town gathered to honor his service. Mayor Thompson presented him with a gold watch engraved with his years of duty, and the townspeople contributed to a substantial purse in recognition of all he had done to keep them safe. "What will you do now?" Dr. Wilson asked during the celebration. Jackson smiled, his arm around Rebecca's waist. "Mrs. Steele has a list." Indeed, Rebecca had long maintained a mental catalog of projects Jackson had started, but never completed due to the demands of his position, expanding their garden, finishing the back porch, building proper bookshelves for their growing library. Beyond those, they spoke of traveling to visit Will, who had established a law practice in Sacramento, and perhaps even journeying east to see the cities Rebecca had described from her childhood. But life, as they had learned many times, often took unexpected turns. 3 months after Jackson's retirement, Rebecca fell ill with a fever that left her bedridden for weeks. Dr. Wilson diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest and careful nursing. Jackson never left her side, tending her with the same devotion he had shown throughout their marriage. "You shouldn't spend all day in this sick room," Rebecca protested weakly as he changed the cool cloth on her forehead. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he replied simply. "Besides, you nursed me through worse after that shooting in '93. Slowly, Rebecca regained her strength, though Dr. Wilson cautioned that her lungs might remain vulnerable. She retired from full-time teaching, passing the head teacher position to Eliza while remaining a special advisor to the school board. The rhythm of their life adjusted to these new circumstances. They spent mornings working in their garden, afternoons reading or playing chess, and evenings on the porch watching the desert sunset. Twice a year, they made the journey to Sacramento to visit Will, his wife Laura, and their young son Jack, who adored his grandparents' stories of the early days in Tonopah Junction. "Grandpa, tell about the time you caught the train robbers," Jack would beg, his eyes wide with excitement. "Well, now," Jackson would begin, settling into his favorite role as storyteller. "It was the winter of '85 and the coldest February anyone could remember. On a warm September evening in 1912, 30 years after they had first met, Jackson and Rebecca sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Rebecca's health had remained stable, and at 62, Jackson was still strong despite the old injuries that ached in cold weather. "You remember what day this is?" he asked, his hand covering hers on the arm of her chair. Rebecca smiled. "How could I forget?" 30 years ago today, a young woman in a torn dress stood shivering at the station, and a kind sheriff gave her his coat. "Best decision I ever made," Jackson said softly. From his pocket, he produced a small box. "I've been saving this for today." Inside lay a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When Rebecca opened it, she found a tiny photograph of them on their wedding day on one side and a recent picture of their children and grandson on the other. "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I wanted something to remind you that everything good in my life came from that moment," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "You, our children, our home, it all began when I saw you standing there, trying so hard to be brave." Rebecca leaned over to kiss him, her heart as full of love as it had been on their wedding day. "Put it on for me." Jackson fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin with the same tenderness he had always shown her. Rebecca touched the locket, knowing she would treasure it always. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching into her pocket. "Not as beautiful as your gift, but perhaps meaningful." She handed him a small, worn leather-bound journal. Jackson opened it, recognizing Rebecca's elegant handwriting. "I began keeping this the day after we met," she explained. "At first, it was just to process all that had happened to me, then it became a record of our life together." She touched his hand. "Read the first entry." Jackson turned to the first page, dated September 6, 1882. "Today I met a man who changed my fate with a simple act of kindness. Sheriff Jackson Steele found me at my lowest moment and offered his coat, his protection, and his respect when I had nothing. I do not know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight I am warm, I am safe, and I am filled with a strange hope that perhaps my journey west was not a mistake after all." Jackson looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You never showed me this." "I wanted to wait for the right moment," Rebecca said softly. 30 years seemed appropriate." He leafed through the journal, glimpsing passages that chronicled their courtship, their wedding, the births of their children, moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, all rendered in Rebecca's thoughtful prose. "This is our life," he said in wonder. "Yes," Rebecca agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last rays of sunlight faded from the desert. "And what a beautiful life it has been." As the stars appeared overhead, Jackson and Rebecca sat together in comfortable silence, their hands entwined. The desert night grew cool around them, but neither moved to go inside. They had weathered far colder nights than this, secure in the warmth of a love that had begun with a coat offered to a shivering woman, and had sustained them through 3 decades of the unpredictable, challenging, wonderful life they had built together in the wild frontier of Tonopah Junction.